Look at a map of Canada, second largest country on Earth, Atlantic to Pacific. It looks deliberate, like someone sat down and planned it. Nobody did. Everything west of Manitoba was carved up by British officials in London, using a ruler and lines of latitude and longitude. No rivers, no mountain ranges, no logic on the ground, just lines. And by accident, those lines enclose some of the richest geology on the planet, fertilizer that feeds a third of humanity, uranium that powers reactors on 4 continents, the third largest oil reserve on Earth, a river system that lights up an entire American region, all of it sealed inside borders drawn by men who never set foot on the land, decades before anyone knew what was underneath it. This is the story of how that happened, and the one place in Canada where the same accident produced the opposite result. Chapter 1. Saskatchewan. Start with the most unremarkable looking province in the country. On a map, Saskatchewan is a rectangle. Lay it over Europe and it swallows Germany, Austria, Switzerland and the Czech Republic, with room left over. And for hundreds of miles in every direction, it barely changes. Flat prairie, straight roads, horizon in every direction. That flatness isn't just scenery, it's the reason the province is worth talking about at all. Hundreds of millions of years ago, an inland sea sat over this land long enough to lay down sediment in layers, kilometres thick. Then the sea left. What it left behind is now buried under a province most people only see through a car window. The first thing it left is farmland, some of the most productive soil in North America. The second thing is almost a kilometre underground. Beneath southern Saskatchewan sits the largest known potash deposit on Earth, close to 40% of global reserves. Potash supplies the potassium in commercial fertilizer, one of 3 nutrients industrial agriculture cannot function without. Take it away, and yields don't dip. They collapse. Saskatchewan alone produces more than twice as much potash each year as Germany, historically one of the world's largest producers. If it were an independent country, it would rank among the most strategically important agricultural suppliers on the planet, not because of what's grown on its farms, but because of what sits beneath them. Then there's the second deposit, 300 miles north, that has nothing to do with food. The Athabasca Basin holds the highest grade uranium ever discovered. At Cigar Lake and McArthur River, the ore runs roughly 100 times richer than the global average. That means less rock mined, less material processed, and more fuel extracted per ton of effort than almost anywhere else on Earth. A single uranium fuel pellet, about the size of a fingertip, holds roughly the energy of a ton of coal. That uranium currently fuels reactors in France, South Korea, the United States, and the UK. And in 2026, the same province added a third resource nobody saw coming. Near the town of Tisdale, a company drilling just 50 feet down hit a deposit later confirmed to hold 6.8 billion tons of alumina, the material refined into aluminum. That's roughly a third of the entire world's known alumina supply, sitting inside a stretch of land about 16 miles across. Canada currently imports almost all the bauxite it needs to make aluminum. This single deposit could turn Saskatchewan into a domestic source large enough to supply the continent, and the province's premier has already floated putting it in the same category as potash and uranium. Chapter 2. Alberta and British Columbia. Saskatchewan wasn't an isolated accident, it's a pattern. The 49th parallel, the border separating Canada from the US along most of its length, was fixed by treaty in 1818. Nobody involved was thinking about oil. The treaty predates the entire industry. But the same geological formation producing oil in Montana and North Dakota keeps going north across that line, and in Alberta it becomes the oil sands. Alberta now holds an estimated 165 billion barrels of recoverable oil, the 4th largest proven reserve on Earth, behind only Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. The rock didn't change at the border, only the flag did. It wasn't only what was underground either. In southeastern British Columbia, the Columbia River begins in the Rocky Mountain Trench before crossing south into the United States. By the time it reaches the Pacific, it has generated more hydroelectric power than any other river system in North America, roughly 40% of the electricity used across the entire Pacific Northwest. The dams are American. The water starts in Canada. 3 provinces, 3 completely different resources, lines drawn with no knowledge of what they'd end up containing. Chapter 3. The Ring of Fire. Here's where the pattern breaks, and it's the part most retellings of this story skip. In 2007, Prospectors flying geological surveys over the James Bay lowlands in northern Ontario picked up a mineral signature unlike anything else in the province. What they'd found was a crescent-shaped deposit of chromite, nickel, copper, and platinum group metals so large that Ontario politicians started calling it Canada's next oil sands. The province's own estimates put the value of the chromite and associated metals at roughly $60 billion. Some industry estimates have run as high as double that. It's called the Ring of Fire, and almost 2 decades later, it is still almost entirely undeveloped. The reason isn't the geology, it's everything around it. The deposit sits about 500 kilometres northeast of Thunder Bay, inside one of the largest wetlands on the continent, with no year-round road, no rail line, and no power grid within reach. Getting a single access road built took nearly a decade of environmental assessment and community negotiation. Construction on the first stretch, the Weber-Quay Supply Road, only broke ground in June 2026, and it isn't expected to open until 2030. Compare that to Saskatchewan's Potash, already moving by rail to ports built a century ago. Or Alberta's oil sands, connected to an entire continent of pipelines and highways, already in place before the deposits were even fully mapped. The Ring of Fire has arguably richer, rarer minerals than either: chromite for stainless steel, nickel for batteries, and none of the infrastructure required to turn rock into revenue. Geology decided what was buried. Infrastructure decided what actually counts. Chapter 4. The Accident in Labrador. If the Ring of Fire shows what happens without infrastructure, Voisey's Bay in Labrador shows what happens when a discovery gets lucky twice. In September 1993, 2 prospectors working under contract weren't even looking for what they found. They were searching for diamonds. Instead, they chipped a rust-coloured outcrop and stumbled onto one of the richest nickel-copper-cobalt deposits in Canadian history, later estimated at over 140 million tonnes of ore. Within 3 years, Inco bought the rights for $4.3 billion, triggering one of the most aggressive corporate bidding wars in Canadian mining history. Unlike the Ring of Fire, Voisey's Bay had one advantage working in its favour: a deep water port close enough to reach by ship. That single piece of geography, not a road, not a rail line, just an accessible coastline, was the difference between a discovery that became a working mine within a decade and a deposit that's been waiting for a road since 2007. And the timing turned out to matter even more than anyone realised in 1993. Nickel and cobalt are now 2 of the core ingredients in electric vehicle batteries. A discovery made by accident, by prospectors hunting for something else entirely, ended up sitting on exactly the minerals the next generation of the global economy would need most. Chapter 5. Why Canada isn't Nigeria. If mineral wealth automatically created prosperity, none of this would be interesting. It would just be a country that got lucky. But wealth underground doesn't guarantee wealth above it. Nigeria has oil. The Democratic Republic of Congo has cobalt, coltan, and gold, much of it more valuable, ton for ton, than anything in Saskatchewan. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. None of the 3 counts as prosperous. Economists have a name for this: the resource curse. When a government can fund itself through extraction alone, it has far less incentive to build the institutions, infrastructure, and rule of law that create long-term prosperity elsewhere. Canada should have been vulnerable to the exact same pattern. It wasn't, and the difference wasn't the resources. It was everything sitting around them: stable institutions, functioning courts, access to capital, and a border shared with the largest consumer market in human history. Resources only become wealth once someone can extract them, move them, finance them, and sell them. Take away just one of those 4 conditions, and the ground underneath stays exactly that: ground. Nearly 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the US border. Almost all the country's resource wealth sits hundreds of miles farther north, in places most Canadians will never see. A ghost town in Saskatchewan, sitting on the richest uranium deposit on the planet, and a stretch of wetland in Ontario holding tens of billions of dollars that nobody can currently reach. The officials who drew those borders in London weren't thinking about potash, uranium, oil, or nickel. They couldn't have been. Most of it wouldn't be discovered for another century. The lines just happened to land there first. Canada isn't sitting on some of the most valuable geology in the world because it planned brilliantly. It's sitting on it because geology doesn't read maps.